Picture this. One morning, you wake up, step outside your ranch house, and discover bright yellow signs scattered across your property. Not just a few signs, dozens of them. Each sign boldly states, "Private HOA Land, no trespassing," in red letters. These signs stretch as far as the eye can see across your 1,300-acre ranch, which has been in your family for 3 generations. This was not a mistake or a misunderstanding. It was a calculated move by a power-hungry homeowners association, HOA, that believed it could claim someone else's land through intimidation and legal manipulation. What they didn't expect was to encounter someone who wouldn't back down. Before we dive into this incredible story of David versus Goliath, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. You are about to witness one of the most shocking cases of HOA overreach ever documented. You'll see how ordinary individuals can fight back against corrupt authority figures and emerge victorious. But the journey was far from easy. By the end of this story, you will understand how the ranch owner turned the tables on an entire HOA board, exposed their illegal tactics in open court, and achieved a victory that changed everything. But first, let's look at how this nightmare began. The ranch owner's name was Marcus Chen, and on that fateful Tuesday morning in March, his quiet life was about to erupt into a legal battle that would consume 2 years of his life and cost him nearly everything he owned. Marcus Chen never imagined that buying his dream property would lead to the fight of his life. A successful software engineer who'd spent 15 years climbing the corporate ladder in Silicon Valley, Marcus had finally saved enough to purchase the 1,300-acre Riverside Ranch in Northern California. The property had been on the market for months, priced fairly but requiring significant investment to restore the old farmhouse and update the infrastructure. For Marcus, it represented more than just a real estate investment. It was his escape from the suffocating tech world, his chance to build something meaningful with his hands, and his opportunity to create a legacy for his young family. His wife, Sarah, was initially hesitant about leaving their comfortable suburban life. Still, she eventually embraced the vision of wide-open spaces where their 2 children could grow up connected to nature. The ranch sat in a unique geographical location, bordered by rolling hills on 3 sides and the Clearwater River on the 4th. What made the property truly special was its isolation. The nearest neighbor was over 2 miles away, and the closest town, Cedar Valley, was a 15-minute drive down a winding country road. This isolation was exactly what Marcus craved after years of traffic jams and crowded office buildings. But here's where the story takes its first ominous turn. About 4 miles south of Marcus's ranch, a new development had been sprouting over the past 3 years. Hillcrest Estates was an upscale residential community designed for wealthy retirees and affluent families seeking a taste of rural living without giving up modern amenities. The development featured 200 custom homes, each sitting on 2 to 3 acre lots, connected by perfectly manicured streets with names like Sunset Ridge Drive and Pastoral View Lane. The mastermind behind Hillcrest Estates was Richard Blackwood, a former city planner turned real estate developer. Richard had a vision that extended far beyond just building houses. He wanted to create what he called a premium lifestyle community where every detail was controlled, every rule was enforced, and every resident contributed to maintaining his version of perfection. Now, you may be wondering how a development 4 miles away could affect a massive ranch that existed long before any planned community. That's exactly what Marcus thought when he first heard about Hillcrest Estates during his property research. The 2 properties seemed completely separate, with no shared boundaries or common infrastructure. What Marcus didn't know was that Richard Blackwood had been studying land ownership patterns in the entire Cedar Valley region for years. He'd identified what he believed were opportunities to expand his control beyond the official boundaries of Hillcrest Estates. In Richard's mind, the success of his premium community depended on controlling not just what happened inside the development, but what happened in the surrounding area that could impact property values. The Hillcrest Estates Homeowners Association, established before the first house was even built, gave Richard the legal framework he needed to pursue his ambitious agenda. As the developer, Richard maintained significant control over the HOA board during the initial years, handpicking residents who shared his vision of aggressive community management. The HOA board consisted of 5 members, but 3 of them were essentially Richard's puppets. There was Margaret Stevens, a retired corporate lawyer who'd moved to Hillcrest specifically because she appreciated strong community standards. Then there was Dr. Harold Mitchell, a former hospital administrator who believed that successful communities required firm leadership and clear consequences. Finally, there was Beverly Thornton, a wealthy widow who had made her fortune in real estate and saw HOA management as a way to protect her investment. Together, this trio formed what residents would eventually call the Iron Triangle, making decisions that went far beyond typical HOA responsibilities. They didn't just manage community amenities and enforce reasonable rules. They conducted detailed research on surrounding properties, studied local zoning laws for loopholes, and developed strategies to extend their influence into areas that weren't technically part of their jurisdiction. But here's what made their approach particularly insidious. Instead of being transparent about their intentions, they operated through a series of shell companies and legal entities that obscured their true motives. They would file vague legal documents, make ambiguous claims about property rights, and use intimidation tactics that relied on most people's lack of legal knowledge. Marcus's ranch represented the perfect target for their expansion strategy. The property was isolated, meaning any disputes would attract less public attention. Marcus was new to the area, so he lacked established relationships with local officials or longtime residents who might support him. Most importantly, the ranch was valuable enough that gaining control over it would significantly increase the HOA's assets and political influence in the region. The stage was set for a confrontation that neither side fully anticipated. Marcus simply wanted to renovate his ranch and live peacefully with his family. The Hillcrest Estates HOA wanted to expand its power and control. These two incompatible goals were about to collide in ways that would expose the darkest aspects of HOA overreach and test the limits of property rights in America. As Marcus spent his first few months on the ranch, focusing on basic repairs and getting his family settled, the HOA board was already developing its strategy to claim his land. They were patient, methodical, and absolutely convinced that they could succeed through a combination of legal pressure and psychological warfare. What they didn't account for was Marcus's engineering background, which had taught him to approach complex problems systematically and never give up until he found a solution. They also underestimated his financial resources and his willingness to spend whatever it took to protect his family's future. The collision between Marcus's determination and the HOA's ambition would create a legal battle that neither side expected, with consequences that would ripple through the entire Cedar Valley community for years to come. The first sign of trouble came exactly 6 months after Marcus's family moved to the ranch. He was repairing a section of fencing along his northern property line when a white SUV pulled up on the access road. 2 people got out. A stern-looking woman in a business suit and a man carrying a briefcase and what appeared to be surveying equipment. The woman introduced herself as Margaret Stevens from the Hillcrest Estates HOA board. Her companion was introduced as a property assessment specialist, though he never provided credentials or explained exactly what he was assessing. Margaret's demeanor was immediately confrontational, speaking to Marcus as if he were a disobedient resident, rather than a property owner who had no connection to her community. Margaret informed Marcus that the HOA had concerns about certain activities on his property that might impact the environmental integrity and property values of Hillcrest Estates. When Marcus asked for specifics, she provided a list of complaints that seemed absurd for a working ranch. His cattle were generating excessive dust, visible from Hillcrest properties. His farm equipment was creating noise pollution during early morning hours, and his plans to install solar panels would create unsightly industrial elements that could be seen from the hills surrounding her community. Now remember, Marcus's ranch was 4 miles away from the nearest Hillcrest Estates property, with rolling hills and forests blocking any direct line of sight. The idea that his normal ranching activities were somehow impacting a gated community miles away seemed ridiculous. But Margaret wasn't finished with her demands. She presented Marcus with a formal compliance notice, demanding that he limit his cattle herds, restrict equipment use to specific hours, abandon his solar panel plans, and allow monthly environmental impact inspections by HOA representatives. The notice included a timeline for compliance and mentioned escalating enforcement measures if he failed to cooperate. Marcus's engineering mind immediately recognized the absurdity of these demands. He politely but firmly explained that he owned his property outright, had no contractual relationship with the Hillcrest Estates HOA, and intended to continue operating his ranch according to local zoning laws and agricultural regulations. He assumed this would be the end of the matter. He was wrong. 2 weeks later, Marcus discovered the first batch of signs. Not the massive display that would later shock him, but a dozen yellow signs placed strategically along his access road and near his main gate. Each sign read, "Environmental Protection Zone, Authorized Personnel Only," with a phone number that led to an answering service that identified itself as Cedar Valley Land Management. Marcus immediately recognized this as an escalation tactic, but he also noticed something important. The signs were placed just outside his property boundaries, technically on county right-of-way land. This meant he couldn't simply remove them without potentially breaking laws himself. It was a clever psychological game designed to make him feel surrounded and under siege without giving him legal recourse. But the HOA was just getting started with its pressure campaign. Over the next month, Marcus began receiving official-looking documents delivered by certified mail. There were environmental impact assessments claiming his ranch was violating watershed protection guidelines. There were zoning compliance reviews suggesting his property use might not match its official designation. There were community standards violations listing everything from inadequate fence maintenance to inappropriate signage, referring to his simple ranch entrance sign. Each document came from a different entity: Cedar Valley Environmental Services, Regional Property Management Associates, and Northern California Land Use Compliance Office. It took Marcus considerable time and effort to research these organizations and discover they were all connected to shell companies ultimately controlled by the Hillcrest Estates HOA board. The psychological impact was exactly what the HOA intended. Marcus found himself spending hours each week responding to frivolous complaints, researching obscure regulations, and trying to understand the legal implications of documents that seemed designed to confuse rather than inform. His wife, Sarah, became increasingly stressed, worried that they'd made a terrible mistake buying the ranch. Their children sensed the tension and began asking why bad people were trying to hurt their family. But if the HOA thought they could break Marcus's resolve through paperwork warfare, they had seriously miscalculated. His engineering background had taught him to document everything, analyze patterns, and identify the root cause of complex problems. He began building a comprehensive file of every interaction, every document, and every tactic the HOA used against him. More importantly, Marcus started fighting back. He hired a property law attorney named Jennifer Walsh, who had significant experience dealing with HOA overreach cases. Jennifer immediately recognized the tactics being used against Marcus and helped him understand that this wasn't really about environmental protection or community standards. This was about a power-hungry HOA board trying to expand its control beyond its legal authority. Jennifer's first move was to send cease and desist letters to all the shell companies harassing Marcus, demanding they provide evidence of their legal authority to make claims about his property. The response was swift and revealing. Instead of providing evidence, the harassment escalated dramatically. Within days of Jennifer's legal challenge, Marcus discovered that someone had been trespassing on his property. Tire tracks near his southern fence line showed that vehicles had been driving across his land, apparently conducting unauthorized surveys or inspections. When he installed security cameras to document future intrusions, he discovered something that would change the entire nature of his conflict with the HOA. The cameras captured footage of the same property assessment specialist who had accompanied Margaret Stevens on her first visit. But this time, he wasn't just looking around. He was placing small metal stakes in the ground at various points across Marcus's ranch, each stake marked with red surveyor's tape and cryptic numbers. Marcus realized he was witnessing something far more serious than he'd initially understood. This wasn't just harassment designed to make him sell his property and move away. This appeared to be the preliminary stages of an actual attempt to claim ownership of his land. Jennifer Walsh confirmed his worst fears. The metal stakes were survey markers, and the numbers corresponded to a grid system used in formal land surveys. Someone was mapping Marcus's property as if they were preparing to file legal claims of ownership or easement rights. The revelation that the HOA wasn't just trying to control his activities, but might actually be trying to steal his land transformed Marcus from a frustrated property owner into a man fighting for his family's future. He authorized Jennifer to conduct a comprehensive investigation into the HOA's activities, regardless of cost. What they discovered would expose a pattern of behavior that went far beyond Marcus's case. The Hillcrest Estates HOA had been systematically researching property records throughout the Cedar Valley region, identifying what they believed were vulnerabilities in property ownership documentation. They had targeted 3 other properties in addition to Marcus's ranch, using similar tactics of harassment, intimidation, and unauthorized surveying. But Marcus's property represented their most ambitious target. If they could successfully claim even a portion of his 1,300 acres, it would establish a legal precedent they could use to expand their reach throughout the entire region. They weren't just trying to control Marcus's ranch. They were trying to create a legal foundation for controlling thousands of acres of private property. The stakes had become enormous, and both sides were preparing for a battle that would determine not just the fate of Marcus's ranch, but the future of property rights in the entire Cedar Valley region. As winter approached, Marcus knew that the HOA's next move would be decisive. They had invested too much time and money in their scheme to back down now, and he had invested too much of his life savings in his ranch to give up. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test the limits of both sides' resolve and resources. What Marcus didn't know was that Richard Blackwood and the HOA board had already made their decision. They were going to make their boldest move yet, one that would shock not just Marcus, but the entire community. They were about to cross a line that would transform their harassment campaign into something that looked remarkably like attempted theft. The morning that would change everything began like any other Tuesday in March. Marcus was in his kitchen, drinking coffee and reviewing plans for spring planting, when his daughter Emma burst through the front door with a look of confusion and fear on her face. "Daddy, there are signs everywhere," she said breathlessly. "Yellow signs all over our land saying we're not supposed to be here." Marcus's blood ran cold. He grabbed his jacket and stepped outside, and what he saw defied belief. Across his entire ranch, as far as the eye could see, bright yellow signs had been planted overnight. Not just along the property boundaries, but throughout the interior of his land. Signs near his barn, signs by the pasture where his cattle grazed, signs along the winding dirt road that led to his house. Each sign was identical. Private HOA land, no trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. Marcus counted over 60 signs as he walked his property that morning, each one strategically placed to create maximum psychological impact. Someone had spent considerable time and effort to execute this operation, and they had done it with military precision during the overnight hours when his family was sleeping. But the signs were just the beginning. When Marcus returned to his house, he found a certified letter waiting in his mailbox. The return address showed it was from Hillcrest Community Land Holdings, LLC, another shell company he'd never heard of. Inside was a document that would have been laughable if it weren't so terrifying. The document titled Notice of Adverse Possession, Claim and Demand for Vacant Possession, claimed that the Hillcrest Estates HOA had established legal ownership of Marcus's entire 1,300-acre ranch through a doctrine called adverse possession. According to the notice, the HOA had been openly and continuously using the land for community environmental protection purposes for over 5 years, which gave them legal claim to ownership under California law. The document demanded that Marcus and his family vacate the property within 30 days or face legal action for trespassing on land that now belonged to the HOA. It included detailed maps showing how the property would be incorporated into an expanded Hillcrest Estates development, with plans for additional luxury homes, recreational facilities, and environmental preservation areas. Marcus's hands shook as he read the document. This wasn't harassment anymore. This was an outright attempt to steal his ranch through legal manipulation and fraudulent claims. The adverse possession doctrine they cited was a legitimate legal concept, but it required actual possession and use of land for a specified period. The idea that the HOA had been using his ranch for 5 years was absurd, considering he'd only owned it for 8 months and it had been occupied by the previous owner for decades before that. Jennifer Walsh's reaction to the adverse possession claim was immediate and decisive. She recognized it as a desperate gambit by the HOA, but also understood that it represented a serious legal threat that had to be addressed through the court system. Even frivolous adverse possession claims could tie up property ownership for years while they worked their way through the legal process. But Jennifer also saw an opportunity. The HOA's aggressive tactics had finally crossed the line from harassment into criminal behavior. By placing signs on Marcus's property without permission and filing false adverse possession claims, they had committed acts that could be prosecuted under both civil and criminal law. The first step was getting the signs removed. Jennifer obtained an emergency restraining order requiring the HOA to remove all signs from Marcus's property within 48 hours. When the HOA's attorney argued that the signs were placed on land the HOA claimed to own, the judge's response was swift and uncompromising. Ownership claims had to be resolved through proper legal channels. Until such resolution, the existing property owner's rights would be protected. But removing the signs was just the beginning of Marcus's fightback strategy. Jennifer had been building a comprehensive case against the HOA for months, and the adverse possession claim gave her the opening she needed to take the offensive. Working with a team of investigators, Jennifer had documented every aspect of the HOA's harassment campaign. They had records of the shell companies, evidence of unauthorized trespassing, documentation of the fraudulent surveying activities, and witness statements from other property owners who had been targeted by similar tactics. More importantly, they had discovered the financial motive behind the HOA's actions. Internal documents obtained through legal discovery showed that Richard Blackwood and the HOA board had been planning a massive expansion of Hillcrest Estates that would more than double the size of the development. Marcus's ranch was the centerpiece of this expansion plan, and controlling it was essential to their vision of creating a premier lifestyle destination that would generate millions in additional revenue. The documents revealed something even more damaging to the HOA's case. They showed that the adverse possession claim was part of a deliberate strategy to acquire private property without paying fair market value. Internal emails discussed how they could use legal pressure and procedural manipulation to force property owners to sell for below-market prices or simply abandon their claims altogether. This wasn't just a property dispute anymore. This was evidence of a criminal conspiracy to commit fraud and theft through abuse of the legal system. Jennifer's counterattack began with filing a comprehensive lawsuit against the HOA, Richard Blackwood personally, and all the shell companies involved in the harassment campaign. The lawsuit claimed damages for trespassing, harassment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, conspiracy, and attempted theft through fraudulent adverse possession claims. But the real bombshell came when Jennifer requested emergency hearings on two crucial motions. First, she asked the court to find the HOA in contempt for filing frivolous adverse possession claims without a factual basis. Second, she requested sanctions against the HOA's attorneys for participating in what she characterized as an abuse of the legal system. The hearings were scheduled for the same week, and Marcus knew that everything he had worked for would be decided in those courtrooms. If he lost, he could spend years fighting frivolous claims while his ranch was tied up in legal limbo. If he won, he would not only secure his property, but establish a precedent that would protect other landowners from similar attacks. The night before the first hearing, Marcus couldn't sleep. He walked his property in the darkness, thinking about everything that had brought him to this moment. 8 months earlier, he had been a successful engineer looking forward to a peaceful life on his ranch. Now he was the center of a legal battle that had consumed his savings, stressed his family to the breaking point, and forced him to become an expert in property law and HOA regulations. But as he walked across his land, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in months: confidence. He had the truth on his side, comprehensive documentation of the HOA's illegal activities, and a legal team that understood exactly what was at stake. Most importantly, he had discovered something about himself during this ordeal. He wasn't going to be intimidated by bullies, no matter how much money they had or how sophisticated their tactics appeared. The HOA had made a crucial mistake in its escalation strategy. By filing the adverse possession claim, they had moved the battle into a courtroom where facts mattered more than intimidation, where documentation was more powerful than harassment, and where justice was supposed to prevail over political influence. Marcus was about to find out if the American legal system would protect his rights or allow itself to be manipulated by a corrupt HOA board with unlimited resources and flexible ethics. The courtroom battles that would decide his fate were just hours away, and both sides knew that the outcome would determine not just ownership of one ranch, but the future of property rights throughout the entire region. The first hearing took place on a Thursday morning in the Riverside County Superior Court. Marcus arrived early, accompanied by Jennifer Walsh and her team of associates carrying boxes of evidence that represented months of meticulous preparation. Across the courtroom, the HOA was represented by a team of expensive attorneys from a prestigious Sacramento law firm, led by a partner who specialized in complex property disputes. Judge Patricia Morrison had reviewed the case files in advance, and her opening remarks made it clear that she understood the broader implications of what she was hearing. This wasn't just a property dispute between neighbors. This was a case that would set a precedent for how HOAs could use legal pressure to expand beyond their legitimate authority. Jennifer Walsh's presentation was methodical and devastating. She began by establishing the timeline of Marcus's property ownership using recorded deeds, title insurance documents, and county assessor records to prove uncontested ownership dating back 3 generations. She then systematically documented every aspect of the HOA's harassment campaign, from the initial confrontational visit to the overnight placement of trespassing signs. But the most powerful moment came when Jennifer presented the internal HOA documents that revealed the true scope of their scheme. Email chains between board members discussed Marcus's property as Target Area Alpha and included detailed financial projections for the expanded development that would be built on his ranch. One particularly damaging email from Richard Blackwood described their strategy as applying pressure until he breaks or sells for pennies on the dollar. The HOA's attorney tried to argue that their adverse possession claim was legitimate, based on their community environmental monitoring activities on Marcus's property. But when Judge Morrison demanded specific evidence of continuous possession and use, the attorney couldn't provide documentation of any activities beyond the unauthorized surveying that had been conducted without Marcus's permission. The judge's ruling on the adverse possession claim was swift and unequivocal. She found that the HOA had no factual basis for their ownership claim, that their filing was frivolous and potentially fraudulent, and that they had abused the legal system to harass a legitimate property owner. She dismissed the adverse possession claim with prejudice, meaning it could never be refiled, and ordered the HOA to pay Marcus's legal costs for defending against the frivolous claim. But Judge Morrison wasn't finished. She also granted Jennifer's motion for contempt findings against the HOA board members, ruling that their pattern of harassment and illegal trespassing showed willful disregard for court orders and property rights. Each board member was fined $5,000 and warned that continued harassment would result in jail time. The second hearing, focused on Marcus's countersuit, took place 2 weeks later. This time, Judge Morrison heard evidence about the broader conspiracy to acquire private property through intimidation and legal manipulation. Jennifer presented testimony from other property owners who had been targeted by the HOA, creating a pattern of behavior that went far beyond Marcus's individual case. The most shocking revelation came from a forensic accountant who had analyzed the HOA's financial records. The investigation revealed that the HOA had spent over $200,000 on legal fees, shell company operations, and surveillance activities related to their expansion scheme. This money had come directly from the Homeowners Association dues paid by Hillcrest Estates residents, meaning that hundreds of innocent homeowners had unknowingly funded a criminal conspiracy. When Richard Blackwood took the witness stand to defend the HOA's actions, his testimony quickly fell apart under cross-examination. Jennifer systematically walked him through each aspect of the harassment campaign, forcing him to admit that the HOA had no legal authority to regulate activities on Marcus's ranch, no evidence to support their environmental protection claims, and no justification for their trespassing and surveying activities. The turning point came when Jennifer presented recordings of HOA board meetings where members discussed their expansion plans. In one particularly damaging recording, Richard Blackwood explicitly stated that they needed to make life so difficult for these rural property owners that they'll be grateful to sell to us at any price. Judge Morrison's ruling in the civil case was even more comprehensive than her decision on the adverse possession claim. She found the HOA board guilty of conspiracy, trespassing, harassment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. She awarded Marcus $150,000 in compensatory damages and $300,000 in punitive damages, specifically noting that the punitive award was designed to deter similar behavior by other HOAs throughout the state. But the financial judgment was only part of Marcus's victory. Judge Morrison also issued a permanent injunction prohibiting the HOA from any contact with Marcus or his property, requiring them to stay at least 500 feet away from his ranch boundaries and forbidding them from filing any future legal claims related to his property without court permission. The impact of Marcus's court victory extended far beyond his individual case. Within days of the ruling, the California State Attorney General's office announced an investigation into HOA overreach throughout the state, specifically citing Marcus's case as evidence of widespread abuse of homeowners association powers. 3 of the 5 HOA board members, including Richard Blackwood, resigned within a month of the court ruling. Margaret Stevens and Dr. Harold Mitchell were voted out by angry Hillcrest Estates residents who were furious about having their HOA dues used to fund an illegal harassment campaign. Beverly Thornton remained on the board but found herself isolated and powerless as new members took control. The financial consequences for the HOA were severe. In addition to the damages awarded to Marcus, they faced legal costs exceeding $400,000. They were forced to settle similar lawsuits from 3 other property owners who had been targeted by their expansion scheme. The total financial impact exceeded $800,000, forcing the HOA to impose a special assessment on all Hillcrest Estates residents to cover the costs. The most significant impact was the precedent established by Marcus's case. Legal experts noted that Judge Morrison's ruling created new standards for HOA accountability and property owner protection that would be cited in similar cases throughout California and beyond. Jennifer Walsh began receiving calls from property owners across the country who were facing similar harassment from overreaching HOAs. She established a specialized practice area focused on HOA abuse cases and became a nationally recognized expert on homeowners association reform. For Marcus and his family, the victory meant more than just keeping their ranch. It meant validation that standing up to bullies, even powerful and well-funded ones, was worth the struggle. Sarah, who had been skeptical about fighting the HOA, became one of Marcus's strongest supporters and even testified at state legislative hearings about the need for stronger HOA oversight. Their children learned lessons about justice, perseverance, and the importance of fighting for what's right that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. Emma, who had been the first to spot the trespassing signs that morning, later wrote a school report about her father's court victory that won a statewide contest for essays about citizenship and civic responsibility. The ranch itself became a symbol of successful resistance to HOA overreach. Marcus received visitors from around the country who wanted to see the property where one family had successfully fought back against institutional bullying. He began speaking at property rights conferences and HOA reform meetings, sharing his story and encouraging others to stand up for their rights. But Marcus never forgot the personal cost of his victory. The 2-year legal battle had consumed his life savings, stressed his marriage, and forced his family to live under constant uncertainty about their future. He often reflected on how different the outcome might have been if he hadn't had the financial resources to hire experienced attorneys and fight the case all the way through the court system. This realization led Marcus to establish the Cedar Valley Property Rights Foundation, a nonprofit organization that provides legal assistance to property owners facing harassment from overreaching HOAs. The foundation has helped dozens of families fight similar battles, often achieving settlements without the need for expensive court proceedings. 5 years after his court victory, Marcus's ranch is thriving. His cattle operation has expanded. His solar panel installation is generating both clean energy and additional income, and his family has built the peaceful rural life they originally dreamed of. The Hillcrest Estates development, meanwhile, struggled with internal conflicts and financial problems that ultimately led to its sale to a new management company. Richard Blackwood left California entirely, moving to Arizona, where he attempted to start a new real estate development business. However, word of his involvement in the Marcus Chen case followed him, and he was unable to secure the financing and partnerships necessary for large-scale development projects. The story of Marcus Chen's victory over the Hillcrest Estates HOA became a cautionary tale for homeowners associations throughout the country. It demonstrated that while HOAs have legitimate authority within their communities, that authority has clear legal limits that will be enforced when challenged by property owners willing to fight for their rights. For anyone facing similar harassment from an overreaching HOA, Marcus's case provides a roadmap for resistance. Document everything, understand your legal rights, find experienced legal representation, and never give up in the face of intimidation tactics. The yellow signs that once dotted Marcus's ranch have been replaced by a single sign at his front gate. Riverside Ranch Est, 1887, still standing. It serves as a reminder that sometimes the fight for justice requires ordinary people to do extraordinary things, and that standing up to bullies, no matter how powerful they appear, is always worth the struggle. What started as one family's fight to protect their ranch became a movement that changed how HOAs operate throughout the entire country. And it all began with a simple principle that Marcus never forgot. When someone tries to take what's rightfully yours, you fight back with everything you have until justice prevails. The question that remains for every property owner in America is this: when faced with institutional bullying and legal intimidation, will you have the courage to stand and fight, or will you let fear determine your future? Marcus Chen's story proves that even when the odds seem impossible, justice can still prevail for those brave enough to demand it.